In 2013, Advocate Viwe Noche made his opening statement on behalf of claimants in a land claim in the Eastern Cape to the Land Claims Court. His statement went as follows. The position we believe we occupy in this case, in Xhosa, they call it Mhlakazi, my lord. We would believe that in law on the facts of this case, we are a mere sideshow in this trial, although the court will say that we are cited as plaintiffs. We are cited as plaintiffs merely because the Act says so, but on proper reading of the Act, the court will find that we are a sideshow. We are a sideshow because we are the claimants, and the claim is not against the landowners. The claim is against the government. Government has accepted our claim. The government has made the decision. Our claim is valid, and therefore, Judge and learned assessor, if there is no dispute between us and the government, then where does it place us in the trial, this trial? When Advocate Noche made this opening statement, the claimants, a community of 52 black Africans, had spent 12 years trying to get restitution proceedings underway. Their claim was nothing less than 66 square kilometers of land, formerly known as the Salem Commonage. If successful, this claim would be one of the largest successful land claims in South Africa. The claim was met with a full spectrum of reactions, from delight and excitement among family members and supporters of the claimants, to shock and suspicion among Salem landowners. For some, it meant that the wheels of justice were finally turning after more than 7 decades of prejudice and dispossession. For others, the claim was laughable at best, as there was no apparent factual basis for it. The claim polarized the entire Salem populace, even neighboring communities in many instances, reawakening long-standing feuds. These feuds were not always positioned along racial lines, as disputes between claimant and non-claimant families also became apparent during the trial. However, that discussion will take place in the lecture dealing with the claim itself. This lecture will deal with the legal instruments that enabled such a claim to be brought to court. We will look at the jurisprudential change that took place after the promulgation of a new and inclusive national constitution in 1993, producing legislation which would endorse a shift from the tenacious protection of property rights to land reform and restitution. In addition, we will briefly discuss the inefficiency of South African government land reform and restitution strategies. This inadequacy has placed the ruling party in a political quagmire and forced it to reconsider its present policies in the face of more radical suggestions from not only opposition political parties, but also from within the ruling party. Even once land claims have succeeded, claimants are often frustrated at the sluggish pace which government takes to finalize these claims. The Republic of South Africa is one of the youngest democracies emerging from a period of almost 350 years of discriminatory policy and practice, systematically designed and maintained in various ways, including legislation and violence, to racially and economically advantage exclusively European and British colonists at the expense of black Africans who had been living on the land prior to that. This systematic policy and practice, which included land reservation and segregation, formed the fundamental basis for colonial rule and later apartheid in South Africa. The Natives Land Act 27 of 1913 formed the cornerstone of the apartheid land disposition apparatus. It attempted to freeze patterns of landholding based on racial lines and made new sharecropping tendencies illegal. It also froze all land transactions between natives and other persons, making any such attempted transactions criminally punishable with a fine or imprisonment. The Land Act also effectively codified and regulated the master-servant relationship between European landowners and black African labor tenants. the Eastern Cape did not escape the grip of the Land Act, and the black African people who lived in this region were at some point in time dispossessed of their land. Fast forward to 1994, the new democratic government recognized the history of dispossession of land, and the need for remedial action was recognized, and upon the adoption of the interim constitution in 1994, provision was made for steps to be taken by government to restore the rights in land to those so dispossessed, or to their descendants. In so doing, the Restitution of Land Rights Act 22 of 1994, or the Act as we will call it in this lecture, was passed by Parliament. The Act must be read with Section 25(7) of the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa, Act 108 of 1996, or the Constitution, which provides that a person or community dispossessed of property after 19th of June 1913 as a result of past racially discriminatory laws or practices is entitled to the extent provided by an Act of Parliament, either to restitution of that property or to equitable redress. Thus, the Act forms part of the constitutional framework for land reform aimed at redressing past injustices of dispossession in this country. It's steeped in a challenging constitutional context in which the public interest imperative of land reform is pitted against constitutional protection of private property rights. Against this background, the legislature used specific language in the Act as a tool to achieve land reform in the country and to remedy the injustices which flow from the dispossession. The Act requires historically determined justice and the application of the principles of equity and fairness. So the Act clearly implores the courts to lean towards granting rights in land where it would be just and equitable to do so within the context of the provisions of the Act. The history against which land reform is set plays a pivotal role in the determination of justice. It's clear from the provisions of the Act that the legislature recognized that some of the history of land occupation and ownership in this country would not be easy to establish. Accordingly, the Act specifically contains certain peculiar features which are intended to grant to the Specialized Land Claims Court, or the LCC, when adjudicating land claims, as well as latitude to admit all relevant evidence to determine such history. The Act is therefore an extraordinary piece of legislation which engenders processes and approaches not normally associated with normal litigation and rules of justice. It's therefore important to examine some of those special provisions which give structure and effect to the land claims processes. Arguably, the most important of these special provisions is Section 2(1) of the Act. This provision lays out the basic requirements for a land claim. So, for a land claim to succeed, all of the following requirements must be present. The claimant has to be a person or deceased estate or descendant of a person or community or a person part of a community who was possessed of a right in land after the 19th of June 1913 as a result of past discriminatory laws or practices. The claim should be lodged no later than the 31st of December 1998. Section 1 of the Restitution of Land Rights Amendment Act 15 of 2014 sought to extend the time for lodging claims to the 30th of June 2019, but this amendment has been declared unconstitutional. The cut-off date for land claims is the 19th of June 1913, which is the date of commencement of the Abhorrent Land Act. This means that any land dispossessed after the 19th of June 1913 due to racially discriminatory practices or laws may be reclaimed, but not before that date. One of the most heated debates on restitution in South Africa relates to this date. Despite divergent views on land restitution within the government and the ruling party, it was agreed that the 19th of June 1913 would be the cut-off date for all land claims in South Africa. 5 points were made to defend this cutoff date. First, it was argued that the 19th of June 1913 represents the date on which the Natives Land Act was promulgated. Second, it was the date on which territorial segregation and apartheid land policy received the so-called official seal. Thirdly, it was contended that while dispossession took place prior to 1913 through wars, conquest, and misguided treaties, these injustices could not reasonably be dealt with by the LCC. Fourthly, it was feared that pre-1913 historical claims on the ancestral land would be impossible to solve and would only serve to awaken and prolong destructive ethnic and racial politics. The fifth point was that land restitution should be settled as soon as possible in order to achieve political and economic stability. In other words, pre-1913 land claims would delay this stability to the detriment of the country. This is also the reason why the final deadline for submitting land claims was the 31st of December 1998. The government used these two dates to set the target for the lodgement of claims in 3 years, for finalizing all claims in 5 years, and for implementing all court orders within 10 years. Charles Simpkins, senior researcher at the Helen Suzman Foundation, argues that the cutoff date must be retained, asserting that the state conceptualization and legislation in force immediately prior to the Land Act forms the basis for working out what is meant by the restitution of property in the post-1994 period. Conceptual development and legislation were undertaken by colonial and republican governments with the capacity to develop law through common law by statute and precedent. This, he argues, can still be studied using documentary evidence. Contrastingly, the understanding of property by black African people depended on orally transmitted custom. He postulates that this can only be reconstructed with a considerable degree of uncertainty. Simpkins argues that even if one could get past these difficulties, a slippery slope would emerge. For example, he uses King Goodwill Zwelithini's intention in 2014, along with other members of the Ingonyana Trust, to claim land which was formerly under Amazulu control in 1838. In his opinion, if the cutoff date were to be removed, the Commission would then be obliged to consider not only that claim, but also the claims of those whose ancestors were dispossessed by Zulu expansion at the time of Shaka and Dingaan. Similarly, land claims in the Eastern Cape would have to be reviewed on the basis of earlier groups, such as the Ku and the San, being dispossessed of their land through conquest. More specifically, the Ongekwa Ku had been occupying the seedveld since at least the early 1750s, approximately 15 years prior to the arrival of the Kunukweba Xhosa. Therefore, their claim to the land is stronger than that of the seedveld AmaXhosa. Restitution of land would, at least for large swathes of land, be impracticable, and so the question of other equitable redress would have to be considered. On the other hand, the 1913 cutoff date has been criticized on the following bases. First, it was argued that as land dispossession predates 1913, the success of land restitution depends on the government's ability to transfer much of this land. To exclude such land from the restitution process compromises the goal of restitution. It was also suggested that there have been waves of dispossession that cover the pre- and post-1913 timelines. For example, in 2016, then-President Jacob Zuma addressed the National House of Traditional Leaders annual parliamentary sitting, in which he said that while the majority of the country's people were formally dispossessed by the Land Act, greater losses were suffered during the 1800s. He said, "I believe as a son of a black man, being black, that we need to shift that cutoff date. But you need to find a reasonable way of addressing the issue within the Constitution." Zuma went on to state that the lack of access to land is the basis for poverty, unemployment, and inequality endured by mostly black people today. He also criticized the land reform legislation that, ironically enough, his own party brought to Parliament and that he helped sign into law. Apart from a clear cut-off period, the Act also provides for the establishment of an investigative commission to deal specifically with land claims, the Commission on Restitution of Land Rights, or the Commission. The purpose of the Commission is to assist and facilitate the land claims processes. It operates as an important first adjudication point that's set up in such a way that a wholehearted attempt is made from the outset to solve each land claim in a non-adversarial manner. Only if that process does not succeed is a claim referred for adjudication. As part of its facilitative role, the Commission is empowered and obliged to give assistance to claimants in the preparation, submission, and prosecution of their land claims. The Act also provides for the establishment of the Land Claims Court, or the LCC, for the consideration of land claim disputes. The LCC is a specialist court, though it usually presides in the buildings of the High Court. When the Commission refers the matter to the LCC, it must request the Minister of Land Affairs to issue a certificate as to whether or not restitution is feasible. Section 33 of the Act instructs the LCC to commit itself to allowing restitution of rights in land to persons or communities dispossessed as a result of racially discriminatory laws or practices. The LCC must also take note of the need to remedy past violations of human rights, requirements of equity and justice, as well as the need to avoid major social disruption. One of the special features of the Act is the unqualified provision for court at the hearing of an appeal to hear further evidence. A further significant attribute is the provision for admission of any evidence, including expert reports, archival records, and hearsay evidence, whether or not such evidence would be admissible in any other court of law. Section 30 relaxes the normal rules relating to the admission of, among other things, hearsay evidence before the LCC. These and other distinct attributes in the Act imply that the courts should liberally lean towards the realization of the objectives of the Act when considering disputed land acts. Finally, the Act's purpose is never punitive or retributive. It's there not to punish those who benefited from past injustices, but rather to restore those injustices. Former Constitutional Court Judge Edwin Cameron emphasized that the Act is not a victor's charter, intent at whatever cost or with whatever means on depriving those who have of what they have. Instead, he described it as a nuanced and generous framework for restoring rights and dignity to those dispossessed of their land after 1913, while affording compensation to those who are affected by successfully proven claims. The Act operates on a fine balance of justice. It should recognize the rights of the previously dispossessed, while not discarding the entitlements of the presently possessed. But this is not always realized. The Act's framework is only as good as the efficiency of its implementation by the state. What follows is a brief analysis of state policies geared towards fulfilling its obligations as per the Constitution and the Act since its inception until now. In 1994, the government had a vision of land reform that emphasized multiple objectives, namely addressing dispossession and injustice, creating a more equitable distribution of land, reducing poverty and assisting economic growth, providing security of tenure, establishing competent land administration, and contributing to national reconciliation. The rural poor, seen as comprising victims of land dispossession, small-scale farmers, farm workers, labor tenants, communal area residents, women and youth, were to be the primary beneficiaries. Progress was slow in the first 5 years of land reform, and most targets were not met. Example, redistribution was nowhere near the target of 30% of commercial farmland within 5 years. pilot schemes were soon fast-tracked into policy, arguably missing an opportunity for better planning. Although land reform projects were exempt from restrictions of subdivision, in practice, large groups of people were expected to operate farms as unitary commercial enterprises. Restitution was transformed from a cumbersome, court-driven process into one with considerable administrative leeway, but relatively few land claims were settled. The Commission found it challenging to provide effective post-settlement support. A host of new land laws were passed aimed mainly at securing land rights. Farm workers and dwellers were protected from arbitrary evictions. The occupation and use rights of labour tenants were protected, but tenants or former tenants could also apply for ownership of the land they occupied. Communal Property Associations, or CPAs, allowed groups to hold restored and redistributed land. However, communal tenure was highly politicized as a result of the lobbying power of traditional leaders, and progress in developing a policy framework was slow and incomplete. In 1999, policy priorities shifted from meeting the needs of the poor to servicing a group of aspirant black commercial farmers. Market efficiency and the de-racialization of commercial farming received renewed emphasis. The Land Redistribution for Agricultural Development, or LRAD program, replaced earlier policy frameworks and was complemented by a comprehensive agricultural support program. Following criticism of a means test which applicants had to go through, the requirements of a minimum cash contribution of 5,000 Rand had to be discarded. In addition, many of the problems experienced in the first 5 years of land reform resurfaced. Official processes remained slow and cumbersome, plagued by poor coordination between different departments and spheres of government. Group projects saw beneficiaries continuing to pool their grants to purchase large farms, but they were not allowed to subdivide these. The large-scale commercial farming model continued to dominate planning and thinking about post-settlement support. Ben Cousins points out that consultants based in the large farm sector remained the main source of expertise for processes of farm business planning, and there was often a large gap between business plans and the needs, desires, and capacities of beneficiaries. Project failures contributed to a public perception that land reform was in trouble. A National Land Summit held in 2005 agreed on a review of willing buyer, willing seller, the expanded use of expropriation, and a proactive role for the state. The following year saw several new policy thrusts: area-based planning, a proactive land acquisition strategy, a draft expropriation bill, and reports on foreign land ownership, land ceilings, and land taxes. The ANC's National Conference in Polokwane in 2007 emphasized the need for an integrated program of rural development, land reform, and agrarian change. Little came of these new directions in terms of implementation strategies. Area-based planning was consultant-driven and unfocused, and proactive land acquisition was reduced to the state purchasing farms and leasing them to redistribution applicants for 3 years. Rhetoric about land reform for smallholders disguised the complete neglect of small-scale producers, with funds for comprehensive agricultural support largely directed to a minority of large-scale producers. Land restitution continued to move slowly, hindered by a small budget, capacity problems, and inadequate funds for post-settlement support. Tenure reform was largely overlooked, with the department devoting few resources to implementing the Land Reform Labour Tenants Act of 1996 or the Extension of Security of Tenure Act 62 of 1997, and CPAs and landholding trusts were mostly neglected. As a result, evictions of workers from commercial farms continued, preemptively and in response to competitive pressures, indicating the weakness of the legal system. The Communal Land Rights Act was passed in 2004, premised on transferring ownership of land from the state to traditional councils and the chiefs. But it was never implemented and was struck down by the Constitutional Court on procedural grounds in 2010. After 2009, rural development, food security, and land reform were identified as priorities of the Zuma government, and the Department of Rural Development and Land Reform was created. Several policy statements have appeared over the past decade, some highly controversial, but practical measures to implement them have been slow to materialize. The Restitution of Land Rights Amendment Act of 2014 attempted to open up land claims for another 5 years until 2019. This could have jeopardized thousands of existing claims that have not yet been settled, as well as another 20,000 that were settled but not yet implemented. New claims lodged since 2014, which already numbered over 120,000 in 2016, would have swamped the processes of already existing claims. In addition, government sought to open up the claims process to traditional readers. It's unlikely that the hundreds of billions of rand required to settle an estimated 397,000 claims will ever be available. The Amendment Act was challenged in court on both substantive and procedural grounds and was found to be unconstitutional. The State Land Lease and Disposal Policy, or the SLLDP of 2013, applies on farms acquired through the proactive land acquisition strategy. It identifies 4 categories of beneficiaries: households with no or limited access to land, small-scale farmers, subsistence farmers, medium-scale farmers already farming commercially but constrained by insufficient land, and large-scale commercial farmers with the potential to grow but disadvantaged by location and farm size. Cousins asserts that this policy is biased towards medium-scale and large black commercial farmers. It assumes that there will only be one lessee per farm, and no mention is made of subdividing large farms. Categories 1 and 2 include labor tenants and farm workers who will be leased state land without any option to purchase. But it's unclear that there are any projects that actually include those categories. Categories 3 and 4 are leased state land for 30 years, with leases renewable for another 20 years, and will then have an option to purchase. The first 5 years of the initial lease is treated as a probation period, and no rental is paid in this period. Thereafter, the rental is calculated as 5% of projected net income. The Recapitalization and Development Program, or the RADP, of 2014 replaced all previous forms of funding for land reform, including settlement support grants for restitution beneficiaries. Business plans written by private sector partners or officials will be used to guide decision making. Funding is for a maximum of 5 years. Beneficiaries must have business partners recruited from the private sector as mentors or co-managers, or within share equity schemes, or through contract farming. The Presidency commissioned a midterm evaluation of RADP in 2013 that revealed its elite bias. Its core aim is commercialization of land reform projects. Large amounts of money are spent on relatively few beneficiaries, with few jobs having been created and access to markets for produce remaining limited. In the 6 provinces covered in the assessment, an average of around 3.5 million rand was spent per project, around 520,000 rand per beneficiary, and job creation cost 645,000 rand per job. Some mentors and partners are milking projects and pay little attention to skills transfer. The 2014 policy document on strengthening the relative rights of people working the land, also known as the 50-50 policy, has not yet been approved. According to this policy, each landowner would retain 50% ownership of the farm, ceding the other 50% to workers, whose shares in the farm will depend on their length of disciplined service. While couched in radical language, this offers workers very little except promising landowners a massive dividend. It's also unclear whether the scheme is to be compulsory or voluntary. In 2009, a moratorium was placed on farm equity schemes, based on a government study never made publicly available. The minister indicated that of the 88 FES or farm equity share projects implemented between 1996 and 2008, only 9 have declared dividends. The policy is illogical, costly, and liable to benefit farm owners rather than workers. Tenure reform remains neglected. Farm workers and farm dwellers continue to be vulnerable to eviction, and only superficial and inappropriate amendments to ESTA have been proposed. Thousands of labour tenant claims have been ignored, and only recent court action has forced the department to commit itself to resolving them. Communal tenure reform policy, although not yet embodied in law, continues to be focused on the transfer of land ownership to traditional leadership structures, with community members offered only statutory use rights. In 29 years, land reform has barely altered the agrarian structure of South Africa and has had only minor impacts on rural livelihoods. Only around 8 to 9% of farmland has been transferred through restitution and redistribution, and many settled restitution claims have not been fully implemented. The great majority of 69,000 urban restitution claims have been settled through cash compensation. No systematic data on impacts are available, but case studies suggest that around 50% of rural land reform projects have brought improvements in the livelihoods of beneficiaries, but these are often quite limited. It's unclear how many recorded beneficiaries still reside on or use the transferred land or benefit from land reform in any way. Institutions such as CPAs remain poorly supported and as a result are often dysfunctional. Joint ventures between claimant communities and private sector partners have experienced major problems. Tenure reform has also largely failed. Landowners have worked out how to evict unwanted workers within the parameters of ESTA, or to buy out their rights, and have done so in large numbers. In communal areas, the only legislation that secures the land rights of residents in the Interim Protection of Informal Land Rights Act is the Interim Protection of Informal Land Rights Act 31 of 1996, which has had to be renewed every year. There are increasing reports of corruption by traditional leaders in areas with minerals. Some traditional leaders attempted to extend territories under their control through restitution claims lodged under the 2014 amendment. So, what has led to the overall failure of land reform policies up until now? Firstly, the aims and objectives of land reform remain largely unclear, and the categories of people intended to benefit from it are not specified clearly enough. This is partly because it has not been conceived of as part of a broader process of agrarian reform aimed at restructuring classes of the rural economy. As a result, agricultural and land policies are not clearly interconnected. Furthermore, no real support for black African smallholder farmers has been on offer, and no land reform farms have been officially subdivided. Informal agricultural markets are ignored. Spatial targeting of land and beneficiaries in zones of opportunity and need, example farms located on the edges of densely settled former Bantustans and on urban edges, has been absent. And local government has barely been involved in planning and implementation. Water reform and land reform have hardly ever been viewed as crucial to each other's success, and urban land has been dealt with separately from rural land. Secondly, there remain misguided assumptions by government which undercut effective policy implementation. For example, the government assumes that assessments of viability are based on the large-scale commercial farm model, and this hinders attempts to support smallholder farming. The rural poor and smallholder farmers are often seen as homogeneous groupings, but are in fact socially differentiated. As a result, targeting those communities is ineffective. Also, measures to promote the informal economy, including markets for food, are absent due to assumptions that only formal markets count and that small-scale producers can easily be integrated into them. Land reform furthermore focuses mainly on rural areas, but urbanization and growth of informal settlements means that key needs and opportunities are missed. Planning processes also see people as passive beneficiaries rather than active participants in co-planning, which lead to inappropriate project design. Thirdly, private ownership is seen by government as the most desirable form of tenure, but is an inappropriate system for most South Africans at present. In 2011, some 60% of South Africans occupied land or housing without their rights being recorded in official systems such as the deeds registry. This includes 17 million people in communal areas, 2 million on commercial farms, 3.3 million in informal settlements, 1.9 million in backyard shacks, 5 million in RDP houses without title deeds, and 1.5 million in RDP houses with inaccurate title deeds. On land reform farms, beneficiaries often lack clearly specified rights to the land they hold through the CPAs and trusts. Fourthly, it's evident that land reform has been captured by elites. The most powerful voices are those of emerging black capitalist farmers, traditional leaders, large-scale white commercial farmers, and agribusiness corporates, who are all benefiting more than the poor. This could be due to the current ineffectiveness of civil society, farm workers being weakly unionized, and small-scale farmers not having their interests adequately represented within organizations such as the African Farmers Association of South Africa, or AFASA. For example, the farm workers' strike in the Western Cape in 2012-2013 managed to increase the minimum wage by 50%, but this has neither stopped mechanization nor evictions on commercial farms. Workers' demands for land of their own were ignored by government. Communal area residents have few forums in which they can make their voices heard, although in areas where deals have been struck between traditional leaders and mining companies, they have begun to defend their land rights. Therefore, it's unsurprising that the then DRDLR Deputy Minister, Nkobisi Skwatsha, was able to announce government's intentions to recreate a class of black commercial farmers, or that traditional leaders would receive government blessing to privately owned communal land. Fifthly, land reform is politically misdirected. Many South Africans view land as giving them a sense of belonging. The loss of land serves as a powerful reminder of oppression and dispossession. Forced removals are not only familiar to families living in rural areas. Many urban dwellers are also familiar with forced dispossession as integral to family histories. It's no surprise then that political parties often invoke land dispossession and the need for redress in attempts to mobilize support. Political rhetoric draws on a narrative in which white farmers and foreigners are depicted as villains, black South Africans are the victims, and government or a particular opposition party are heroes rising to the rescue. A political imaginary centered on race tends to dominate the land discourse. In this context, the ruling party is being challenged by the economic freedom fighters, which calls for confiscatory land reform without compensation. The ANC reacts by issuing radical-sounding policy statements that disguise the elite bias of current policies. Vote catching is a key consideration, and probably explains the 2014 decision to extend the period for lodging of new restitution claims and the 2017 announcement by the ANC of their intentions to revise the Constitution, particularly Section 25. Another key problem is that state capacity is inadequate. Land reform is necessarily complex and time-consuming. Therefore, the state's capacity to effectively deal with it is crucial. It requires strong leadership and management, adequate budgets, appropriate policies, sound institutional structures, efficient procedures, and an effective system for monitoring and evaluation. All of these have been problematic, and DRDLR is known as one of the weakest of government departments. Monitoring and evaluation is critically important if mistakes and false starts are lessons to be learned. But in relation to land reform, it has been highly ineffective. The lack of adequate data on the rural economy provided by Stats SA compounds the problem. Finally, the constitutional framework is perceived by the ruling party and certain opposition parties as a limitation to land reform. However, the Property Clause, Section 25 of the Constitution, which currently requires compensation to be paid for land acquired by the state, is not a fundamental constraint. Acquiring farms at prices below market value is possible, given that compensation only has to be just and equitable, but land reform would probably slow down considerably due to refusal by current landowners to sell their property at that value, and due to the subsequent court action that will follow. However, if the budget for land reform increased from its present level of 0.4% of the national total budget to even 2%, for example, then land purchase would be a lot more affordable. Incompetent political will is more of a limitation than the Constitution. In other respects, the Constitution is actually enabling land reform efforts rather than disabling them. In particular, Section 25(6), which requires that the state secure the land rights of black South Africans, is of key significance. All forms of property are protected, not only private property. Given evidence of attempts at state capture by private elements and the woeful human rights record of mining operations in communal areas, measures to protect the poor from current dispossession are urgently required. Litigation and other connected struggles continue to attempt to compel the state to meet its constitutional obligations to secure tenure without requiring private ownership. Land reform needs to make a clean break from its present course, starting with a clear vision of how it can contribute to addressing structural inequality and poverty. This vision should be tempered with some pragmatism. Land and agrarian reform by itself is unlikely to reduce the poverty of most of the rural population. The creation of jobs and vast improvement of the primary and secondary education systems for the majority of the population in both urban and rural areas should be the issue at the center of national politics. However, a reinvigorated and well-researched program of land reform, together with the creation of new irrigation schemes, could make a substantial difference for many households. It seems that government has taken heed and has resolved to adopt such a vision, at least in part. In May 2019, the Presidential Advisory Panel on Land Reform and Agriculture report was published highlighting the need for a shared vision for land reform, which would benefit the poor. It admitted that the state needed to look introspectively and cease with its elitist tendencies. The report also urges government to commit to implementation of land reform once it's capable of curbing the corruption within. It also calls for active participation, not only between government and affected communities, but also with the private sector, allaying fears by managing the social and economic risks in a responsible manner. With that in mind, structural realities such as the monopolization of agricultural production in a small productive core of capitalist farming enterprises should be considered. In 2002, only 5,370 farming enterprises only 12% of the total 45,800 farming units contributed around 62% of total turnover. Today, the proportion of value produced by the top 20% of farm enterprises is likely to be even higher, estimated to be as high as 80%. This concentration of production has been driven by integration into global markets, increased competition, mechanization, and specialization. These have been accompanied by a drastic reduction of farm workers employed. As of 2017, the formal sector employment on farms stands only at around 400,000 workers. In communal areas, approximately 2 million households engage in some form of agricultural production, producing crops as a main or extra source of food. A minority of small-scale black African farmers, numbering around 200,000, sell farm produce to markets as a main or extra source of income. These loose value chains are poorly documented and largely ignored by policymakers. Radically reconfiguring the country's agrarian structure should be the main focus of land and agricultural policy, and this will clarify who should be the key beneficiaries of reform. However, securing tenure rights should remain a key objective of land reform and focus on legal recognition of social tenures rather than on private title. This will assist in poverty reduction efforts more generally. It's important to ensure that land rights connect in practical ways to production, employment, and livelihoods. Land rights involve much more than just the law, and rights must be able to be realized in practice. Local political struggles are often required, such as those engaged in by women challenging patriarchal power relations. Land and agrarian reform must thus include rights-based approaches and support for such local political struggles. Solving the land question in the post-apartheid period also means addressing the intertwined oppressions of race, class, and gender. The student movements of Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall have put intersectionality on the agenda of social transformation, forcing South Africans to consider the interconnected nature of oppression in general. Land reform should aim to address race, class, and gender simultaneously. As Henry Bernstein states, class relations are universal, but not exclusive determinations of social practices in capitalism. They intersect and combine with other social differences and divisions. Changes in class and gender relations must thus also be present at the core of redistributive programs that address racial inequality. But changing class realities should be seen as central to land reform, grounding struggles against other kinds of oppression in its attempts to open up space for new kinds of livelihood opportunities.